Good morning. So I have some good news and some bad news. I'll start with the good news. This is my mom. I was born in Israel, which means that I have a Jewish mom, which means that after every single engagement, she wants to know how it went. So if I disappoint you, I disappoint her, I will do my best not to disappoint you. Now the little bad news, in case you haven't noticed, have a little bit of an accent. I was born in Israel, but grew up in Texas. So shalom, y'all. We flew over when I was 9, and this is what we're expecting. And this is what we got. Anybody recognize this place? El Paso, exactly. So when we landed, this was the, get to see it again. This was the airport my brother and I thought were actually crash landing. And I want to talk for a moment about aviation and talk about this guy, Jacob Van Zanten, who in 1974 was the head of safety for KLM Airlines. And he was literally the poster child for the airlines. He was known for getting you there on time, and getting you there safely. And he had just finished running a month-long training on 747 safety when he was back in the cockpit. And he was flying a group of tourists from Holland to the Canary Islands. And when he's mid-air, he gets this radio message saying that there was a terrorist threat in his intended airport. And he gets diverted to this tiny little island in Tenerife. And when he lands, it's this tiny place. There's all these other 747s that were diverted. The people in the control tower are more concerned about listening to a soccer match, a little distracted. But the things going on in his head are two things. One is, I need to get there on time, because if you were going to stay on the ground for too long, the mandated rest period would kick in. And then he and the crew would all be stuck there, and the passengers would be stuck there. So he tried to keep the passengers on board, tried to refuel early. And remember, he's the poster child for the airlines. And finally, the terrorist alert in the other airport gets lifted. And he refuels, and he just goes as fast as he can to the runway. But by then, a thick fog had covered the runway. And that's when he does the unthinkable. The head of safety for the airlines takes off without ATC clearance.
We have 700 meters visibility here now.
Wait a minute. We don't have ATC clearance.
We're going.
Captain Van Zanten, highly stressed, knowing that he has to take off or abandon the flight. His crew, aware that he's done wrong but frightened to tell him. Disaster is now inevitable.
God damn. Come.
There's another Pan Am 747 blocking the runway. He didn't see it. This is the biggest aviation accident in terms of numbers of lives lost in the history of aviation. And the next day, the Dutch show up to investigate what happened. And one of the first people they call is, guess who? Van Zanten. Remember, he's the head of safety for the airlines. So how could this guy do such an unthinkable thing? What do you guys think? Huh? Ego? What else? Mission focus? What else? Stress? Loss aversion? He was really worried about the perceived loss of staying there for a little bit longer. We also have to think about his crew. Remember, his crew is like, wait a second, we don't have ATC clearance. If you're sitting in the co-pilot seat, how do you cope with that? And how do you effectively listen to those around you? and amplify and give them a voice. And this is what we're going to talk about. How do we create these networks to help us become better leaders? And to do this, we're going to go back in history a little bit. I'm going to go to the 16th century to Hernan Cortez, who shows up in modern-day Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. And he marvels, this is the Aztec capital, he marvels by the complexity of the civilization. There's pyramids, there's roads, there's infrastructure, but he's not really there to sightsee. Why is he there? Get gold, right? So he says, take me to your leader, and takes him to this guy, Montezuma II. And he gives Montezuma an ultimatum. So, hey, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good. So you, Montezuma II, this dude shows up with 80 horses, 80 men, and he says, give me all your gold, or I'm going to kill you. What do you say?
No.
Okay. Exactly. But unfortunately, Montezuma wasn't U.S. military. So he's like, sure, you can have my gold. Gives him the gold. But the problem is that Cortez is not a man of his word. Kills Montezuma. Not only that, he blockades the Aztec capital. Within 2 weeks, 200,000 people die. And within 2 years, the entire Aztec civilization is conquered. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Cortez was so effective. There was infighting amongst the Aztecs. There was the introduction of a new weapon in the form of the horse. There was the introduction of biological weapons in the form of the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. But you can't ignore the fact that a few men and a few horses completely took over the civilization. And the Spanish did the exact same thing with the Incas a few years later and take over the Inca civilization. Give us all your gold or we're going to kill you. They killed the leader. And by the end of the century, the Spanish have effective control over the entire South continent. And it's at the winds of victory in their backs that the Spanish encounter my old stomping grounds and encounter the Apache. Unlike the Aztecs, the Apache didn't have any roads, didn't have any pyramids. What else isn't there in El Paso, Texas? Gold, right? Like, if anybody has been there. So they say, well, the next best thing is you can adopt to our agrarian lifestyle. And here's the other interesting difference between the Apache and the Aztecs. Unlike the Aztecs, the Apache didn't have top-down command and control. They had these leaders called Nantans. The most famous one is Geronimo. The phrase, you should, does not exist in the Apache language. If you want to follow Nantan, you can. If you don't want to follow Nantan, you don't have to. Now, the moment that the Spanish took out a Nantan, a new one would just take his or her place. And here's where it gets really interesting. The harder that the Spanish fought against the Apache, the stronger the Apache became. This was the Apache territory when the Spanish first encountered them. And after 200 years of first facing the Spanish, then the Mexicans, then us, the Americans, this was a territory. It more than doubled. In order to understand why, we turn to biology. When I was a kid, I used to have this friend, God knows what became of him, because his hobby was to take the legs off of ants. God, right? He's probably sitting in prison somewhere. Anyways, what happens when you take the leg off of a spider? It hobbles, right? What happens when you take off the head of a spider? What happens when you take off the arm of a starfish? How come? Biology, yes, exactly. Science and biology. More specifically, the starfish, unlike the spider, does not have a central head. Each one of the arms has all the organs necessary in order to create an entirely new creature. This is not photoshopped. This is a Linkia starfish growing an entirely new creature. And we think about this as a metaphor for business and society. And we're going to fast forward from the 16th century to Boston. And in the early 2000s, there was this kid who liked to take a lot of naps. So what do people call him? Napster. Now, do you guys remember what Napster's business model was? What was it? Huh? Giving away for free. Okay, so you're the head of the music industry, and someone's giving away for free your music. What do you do?
Bad thing. Take it away.
What do you do to them, though?
You sue them.
Exactly, we're Americans, you sue them. So the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, Sony versus Grokster, and Napster goes out of existence. The moment that Napster goes out of existence, though, a new company called Kazaa comes into business. They're a little bit more decentralized. They get sued, which eventually gives us Emule. No one knows who created Emule. Who are you going to sue? Now, I'm going to show you a screenshot. My mom would not approve, but anybody knows what's going on here? Come on. This is such a goody two-shoes room, okay? I live in San Francisco. People recognize this. So we have a lot of kind of bad stuff here, right? There's some what appears to be pot and pills and powders. This is essentially an eBay for anything illegal you can think about. This is the Silk Road. The Silk Road lives on the dark web. Now, have you seen it? Don't do it on a government computer. Don't do it on a government computer, whatever you do. Speaking of which, in order to surf the Silk Road, you have to go on the Tor network, which is an anonymized network. Anybody knows who created the Tor network? Yep. And all transactions are conducted using Bitcoin, which is a currency based on starfish. So the government was understandably trying to go after the head of the Silk Road, but they didn't know who it was. And ultimately, a package gets intercepted from Canada to, surprisingly enough, San Francisco. And that package had 8 passports in it. And the passports had the picture of the same dude on them. So the government was like, hey, maybe we should kind of follow this person around, right? And they track him to the San Francisco library. He's sitting there on his laptop. The FBI actually stages a fight, a fake fight between a couple to distract him, yanks his computer, and arrests him. This guy, his name was Dread Pirate. He goes on trial for manslaughter for all the people who died of overdoses because of what they bought on the Silk Road. They take the Silk Road down. How long does it take the Silk Road to go back online? 2 hours. The harder that you fight a starfish, the stronger it becomes. So then a new person, this guy named DEFCON, this guy takes over. And he gets arrested. But the Silk Road is still alive and well. If anything, it's getting pushed more and more into the dark web and more decentralized. Now, we can sit here and we can look at the music industry and we can look at the DEA and we can say, God bless them. But I would say these are actually really smart individuals. The thing is, they didn't understand the basic DNA that makes starfish organizations so powerful. And we're going to talk today about the power of networks of inclusion and how we can leverage those in our own organization. So the first element of the DNA are circles. When my book first came out, I heard from this guy named Neil Cole. And Neil told me about something called the home church movement. As the name suggests, instead of meeting in physical churches, the home church movement meets in people's houses. And how many people fit in a living room? Like 15 or so, right? So when they get bigger beyond that, they split into a new church. And when they get bigger beyond that, they split into a new church, etc. Now, Neil invites me over to an event in San Diego for home church pastors. I'm like, Neil, I was born in Israel, hint, hint, hint. I can give you a deal on bagels. And he's like, no, it's okay. Come to San Diego. So it's a room kind of like this, but instead of people being in uniform, it's people who are home church pastors. And there's a couple hundred people in the room. Now, what would you guess? What would you guys guess? What would you guess? How many members do you think the home church movement has? 2,000? What do you guess? Huh? 1 million! Oh my God, this is like an eBay auction. What do you guys guess? 10,000. My guess was 200,000. It was way off. The conservative estimate is 200 million. This is the biggest religious movement that none of us have heard about. And it's especially powerful in China, because in China, you're not allowed to meet in churches. The harder that you fight a starfish, the stronger it becomes. The second element of the DNA are catalysts. We're going to talk about modern-day non-tons. Remember Geronimo? Anybody recognize who this guy is? His name is Jimmy. He was a trader in Florida who wanted to create a resource for kids who didn't have enough money. So he created an online encyclopedia. Didn't have enough money to hire editors, so started Wikipedia. Raise your hand if you've bought an encyclopedia in the last week. Last month? Do you guys remember like being in elementary school and like I would write a report based on which encyclopedia was there? So if it was D, I'd write about ducks or whatever, right? Encyclopedia Britannica just announced they're no longer printing physical copies. Now I'm going to show you a video, and I promise you it's going to be very boring but important, okay?
Alright, so here we are in front of the elephants. Cool thing about these guys is that they have really, really, really long fronts, and that's cool. And that's pretty much all there is to say.
All right. Okay, so learn a little thing about elephant. Why is this video so important? It came out in 2006. First YouTube video. This is the founder of YouTube. So I showed this video at a company. I shouldn't say their name, but it ends with Crowsoft. And I was like, you guys should really pay attention to this. And they're like, this is just a bunch of cat videos. YouTube gets bought by Google for about $1 billion. The thing is we don't understand the power of these things, of these starfish networks, until it's too late. Which brings us to this way of understanding them. So Julie Andrews played back-to-back roles in 2 movies, Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. So here, I won't punish someone for sitting in the front. You seem like you're a really big musicals fan.
Not really.
Okay, so Sound of Music. Do you remember what happens at the end of Sound of Music?
They all go singing into the mountain.
Yeah, exactly. They escape into the mountains, and she marries the dad.
Uh-huh.
What happens at the end of Mary Poppins?
I can't remember.
You guys remember? She leaves, specifically, right? What happens?
She leaves.
Yeah, she leaves. I need to go all the way down there to get it from you directly. Exactly. She leaves. She gets on her umbrella. And when you think about it, it's exactly the same movie, right? Julie Andrews comes in. There's a dysfunctional family. Whoa, sorry about that. There's a dysfunctional family. They sing a lot of songs. They get better. At the end of Sound of Music, she marries the dad. At the end of Mary Poppins, she creates something and she gets out of the way. Which brings us, to this guy. So a few years ago, I hear from this guy in the US Army. Now, as context, I'll talk about this in a bit, but I teach at UC Berkeley. I went to UC Berkeley. I live in San Francisco. You can guess my politics, right? I had never had a conversation with anyone in uniform, and this guy calls up. He's a 4-star general. My first question, is there a 5-star general? He says no. I didn't know what to call him, so I called him Marty. So this is Marty Dempsey, who at the time was in charge of leadership at US Army and went on to obviously become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he talks to me about how the United States has been fighting a decentralized opponent, and how in order to fight a network, we need to be more networked ourselves. And he asked me, Ori, what would you do to make the army more starfish-like? And I don't really think oftentimes before I talk, so my first reaction was, I don't know. I am not a contractor. I don't have a TQM or whatever it is that people try to sell you guys. I was like, I don't think one system will solve it. But you don't know either because of the stars in a uniform. You're too far removed from the edge of the network. And for the last 8 or 9 years, we've been working with first the Army and then eventually all the other branches to create these starfish networks within very structured hierarchical organizations, and use that as a way of getting knowledge from the edge. And think about it for a moment, let's put ourselves in the shoes of Dempsey or of what Millie's shoes will soon be, and think about threats, right? Now, we took care of this guy, but who's going to be our next threat? Is it this guy? Or is it this guy? And the thing is that we don't know. And by the way, a lot of the Russian attacks have been very starfish in their nature. Have been very distributed. I've had a lot of cells working very independently and very effectively against us. But the US military said, well, in order to combat an unknown future, we need agile leaders. Now, what is an agile leader? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of someone who is very rigid and they go to like a half-day program and comes out really agile. A 5-day program and comes out agile? I don't think agility is necessarily something that we can teach on an individual level. Rather, I think that agility is something that we can think about from a team and network perspective. It's basically what Will was just talking about. Surrounding yourself with effective people who, depending on the context of the situation, will help you solve the most difficult problems. And I hate to use this as a positive metaphor, but let's look for a moment at terror networks. Let's say that you're planning, I don't know, you're bombing a bridge somewhere, right? So maybe you're going to recruit someone who knows about explosives, maybe someone who knows about cell phones. Let's say that you wage a cyber attack. And then maybe you'll recruit someone who knows about IP, maybe someone who knows about computer networks. The nodes of the network are not necessarily agile. I'll repeat that. The nodes of the network are not necessarily agile. But depending on the context of the situation, they rise up and they create an agile network for us. And what Dempsey and we just had a book come out in March. What we talk about is that in order to be effective leaders in this era, we need to embrace inclusion. Not just as a nice to have, but as a strategic imperative. And what we argue is that the world has gone from top-down networks to distributed networks to narratives. And specifically, think for a moment from the opponent's perspective. If I'm going to wage war against the United States, I'm not going to be very effective at waging a war for geography or for resources. At least not yet, right? We have superiority so far. What I can do, however, is I can wage a war for time. And that narratives are the new organizational structure. Which brings us back to our friend Sean Fanning from Napster. He went on and was involved in another little company called Facebook, and was the president of Facebook. Now let's listen to Sean describe in his own words Facebook's business model.
You know, if the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it, that thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And I think that the inventors, creators, and it's me, it's Mark, it's the Kevin Systrom at Instagram, it's all of these people, understood this consciously, and we did it anyway.
It's a battle for time. And we need to think about videos as the organizing principle. And we need to think about videos in biological terms. All biological organisms need to do two things. What are the two things they need to do? Survive. And how do we survive? We eat and we reproduce, right? So let's look at a case study of Toyota. So Toyota makes a lot of cars, everything from pickup trucks to the Toyota Prius. I'm going to show you a video. I apologize, this has a couple of bad words in it. You've heard worse. But this is a woman who was driving a Prius who got really upset that someone was parking their truck by her.
I came over here because it was quiet, because there was nobody here, and you come up here with your gas-guzzling piece of shit, and the exhaust is spewing everywhere, and
Don't you swear in front of my
Shut
daughter.
the fuck
Get
up.
out.
Okay, so this gets posted on YouTube. And remember, what videos need in order to survive for the economics of any company that hosts videos is viewers. Viewers equals dollars. So it gets posted, and gets reposted, and reposted, and reposted. When you type in Prius into YouTube, the most watched video is this video. Imagine you're Toyota and you're like, what did we do? Now, the second thing that organisms need to do is to reproduce. And because of this video, there are all of these derivative videos. And one of them is something called coal rolling, where basically people take diesel trucks and they run them dirty. And they run them by protest. This is what it looks like.
It is locker talk.
Okay, you get the idea. The coal rolling page on Facebook has more views than the electric car page. Videos want to eat, and they want to reproduce. And with this new environment in mind, there are 5 concrete takeaways to be effective leaders. The first is that we can relinquish control in order to gain power. We've talked about spiders, we've talked about starfish, but don't leave this presentation thinking that starfish good, spider bad. If I'm trying to get a piece of equipment from here to Afghanistan, I want a pretty spider approach to getting it done. Where it gets really interesting is the combo special. How do we create starfish within spider organizations? And this brings us back to Neil. Remember Neil Cole from the Home Church Movement? I saw him not too long ago in Dallas, and there was this home church convention. Now check out where Neil is sitting. It's a mega church. So mega churches, this 10,000 person church, is realizing that in order to be effective, they're using the power of the home churches. What are the starfish that you can create inside of your unit? And how can you have it operate whether it's in uniform, out of uniform, on the edges of the organization to allow more creativity. Because starfish will give you power. The second implication is how do we listen, amplify, and include. And I want to talk for a moment about surprise neurons in our brains. So have you ever sat in a room and like it's a loud room, it's a restaurant, and all of a sudden you hear your name, like all of a sudden I'll hear Ori, and I'll be like, hey, why did someone call my name? What happens is that your brain listens to a lot of information, but there's specific neurons that only let information in that is surprising. How do we figure the same thing out for our leadership models? Because we're so inundated with data and more data, how do we get people around us to find some of that data surprising? I'm going to talk about how garbage cans are saving lives. This is kind of nasty. I'm sorry to show it to you right in breakfast, but anybody know what this is? This is antibiotic-resistant staph infection called MRSA. It kills more people than HIV/AIDS every year. Your best way of getting MRSA is go to the hospital. We've known how to prevent this since the 1800s. You wash your hands, right? So hospitals are realizing people are dying because of this. At the Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia, it realizes, hey, people are dying, let's do something about it. So they tried to put up signs above sinks that reminded people to wash their hands. Anybody thinks that those signs worked? So they put up colorful signs. Those didn't work. So then they put up even more outrageous signs. Those didn't work. Sounds familiar at all to you in your lives, right? Information does not change behavior. Information does not change behavior. If it did, all of us would floss, none of us would smoke. So instead of just spewing information at people, at Albert Einstein Medical Center, they assembled everyone from the head of infection control to the janitor. And the janitor had an observation. He said, you know what, in these wings where there's a lot of infection, the garbage cans are empty. We're like, that's kind of weird. So there's a model that we have, nothing about me without me. So we went to that wing and we said, hey, why aren't you washing your hands? You know, this will prevent infection. And he said, well, the nurses in this wing have extra small hands. And this hospital is so cheap, they don't give us enough extra small gloves. So we said, well, what if we give you enough extra small gloves? He said, well, of course, we're going to use them. The janitor busts out a pen and writes down his number next to the glove receptacle. Every time they run out of gloves, they call him up. It's small incremental changes like that within a year, and there was a JAMA report on this, reduced the amount of infection by 70%, 70%. Now, it's not to say that the janitor should be made the head of infection control. Nor is it to say that the entire hospital should have extra small gloves. Rather, it's small incremental changes like that. Think about the network, right? How do you enable different nodes of the network to activate depending on the context of the situation? The third implication is how do we create the culture for imagination? We're going to look at civilizations. Civilizations like to leave stuff behind, right? The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese. And yet one of the most powerful conquerors of all time, Genghis Khan, didn't leave any monuments behind. He was powerful because he would assign 8 ponies to every rider. There was this flat stirrups, which means that you could stand as you rode. There was these compound bows. There was arrows with holes in them. Anybody know why there were holes in them? Psychological warfare, so you could hear them before they came. This is what it looked like. And they were vicious. There's stories of them building a wall around an entire village, killing everyone in that village except for 2 people so they can tell the stories of how effective the Mongols were. Yet the Mongols didn't leave any monuments behind. What they did so effectively was take over the continent. This was their territory in 1206, and this was their territory just a few years later. If anybody tells you you can't win a land war in Asia, tell them about the Mongols. What they did leave behind are bridges, more bridges than any civilization has left in history. If you've ever seen a Russian have tea, that's because the Mongols brought tea from China to Russia. If you ever had lemon chicken, that's because the Mongols brought lemons from Persia to China. If you've ever seen this guy using playing cards, that's because the Mongols used them as a way of conducting trade in the kingdom. If you ever used these kind of numbers, that's because the Mongols brought Arab numbers to the rest of the world. Anybody try to do long division using Roman numerals? Not so easy, right? And they were effective because of the Silk Road, not the one that some of you have checked out, but the original Silk Road. And within a day's journey on the Silk Road were these protected enclaves that actually communicated with one another using smoke signals. And different people from different parts of the kingdom were able to get together and share information. Innovation tends to happen when we contextualize something from one field and we contextualize it into a different field. And yet we have this myth. I live in Silicon Valley. We have this myth of the lone genius, of Archimedes getting into the tub. We show pictures of Steve Jobs. Let's listen to Steve Jobs, in his own words, describes his innovation process when he went to visit Xerox PARC.
And they showed me really three things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other two. One of the things they showed me was object-oriented programming. They showed me that, but I didn't even see that. The other one they showed me was really a networked computer system. They had over 100 Alto computers, all networked, using email, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even see that. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
Gives Apple the first operating system. Now, Apple would never steal, would they?
I mean, Picasso had a saying. He said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And we have, always been shameless about stealing great ideas.
What are the great ideas that you can steal from your own organization, from your own unit? And I'm going to show you a video of people doing the Lindy Hop. And I want you to pay special attention to their feet. This is from a couple of years later at the BBC studios, and pay attention to the feet. Anybody recognize who this is? Not for the stare. Good, Muhammad Ali.
Ali just danced like Fred Astaire that night, just like he was on a jitterbug contest. And Ali had the lightness and the swiftness and the quickness of feet, connected with his body, his hands, his arms, his head, all together. He never danced like that again. And that was just something to behold.
He had a ball that night. He was a happy character because the ring was his domain, his kingdom.
Muhammad Ali takes the Lindy Hop and puts it inside the boxing ring. Now, surely there's some innovation, right? This is from the Apollo Theater, Michael Jackson. (1956), also the Apollo Theater. introduce this to this guy. Anybody here speak Russian? You probably all will soon, but help us pronounce this guy's name. This guy? Sorry, this guy. Pyotr Fintsev. Okay, so Pyotr Fintsev was a Russian mathematician living in the height of the Cold War in the 1980s, and had this hypothesis about geographic planes and how they deflected radiomagnetic energy. Yesterday, we talked about stealth. How did stealth actually get discovered? Well, Lockheed gets their hands on this publication because the Russians cared so little that they let him publish internationally. And they put an object under a radar, and they get stealth. The Russians had everything they needed in order to have stealth. They didn't just see what's right underneath their noses. Who are the Pyotrs in your organization? How do we empower them? How do we get them to get a sense of belonging so that they fit? And when we think about belonging, I think we need to think about the spirit of belonging. And we need to think about it from spiritual terms. I live in Silicon Valley. Every other week, there's dignitaries that show up, and they have different tours of Silicon Valley. And I think those are wonderful, but I think there's a little bit of a Disneyland element to them. And I think that we need to understand the region, both if we are to create alliances with it, but also if we're to replicate it from a spiritual perspective, and specifically from a geographical perspective. So when most people show up, they show up down here in San Jose, and they visit all the tech companies, right? Like the eBays, the Googles, whatever. And then they drive about 20 minutes, and they go to Sand Hill Road. And that's where all the money is, all the venture capital. So tech and money, tech and money. And they've tried to replicate tech and money across the world. It's never really fully worked. And I think that what's happening is that we're looking at only 2 points of a 5-pointed star. We're going to talk about what's happening in San Francisco. Say what you will about San Francisco, but it's an artist town. A portion of every new building's money has to go towards public art. You have to look at what's happening at Berkeley. And Berkeley is a place of imagination. So the campus was originally founded as a land grant, as a mining school. Let's imagine that there's some gold in those hills. Let's imagine that there's equal rights or civil rights. And the 5th element of the star goes all the way to a place of spirituality. Whenever we understand a new place, right? If I need to understand Rome, I need to understand its spiritual center. If I understand Jerusalem, right? And the soul of Silicon Valley, I would argue, is at Burning Man. My brother gives me a whole lot of crap for going to Burning Man. He's like, this is a little crazy. It's an art festival in the desert. It's interesting. It's a decentralized city of about 80,000 people. There's no currency. There's no bartering. It's a gift economy. And people are allowed to have very different forms of art. And think about that from a perspective of belonging and participation. This is a video from one of the first years I was at Burning Man, and my friend Craig built a 30-foot tall dinosaur.
So we didn't really have any idea of how to build an art car, and we said, well, what could we do that we could just put something on top of a car? And Tom thought of, well, how about a deck? And we basically built a kitchen deck, or a barbecue deck, whatever, on top of a car. We took a bunch of conduit and hinges and one of those little universal joints that comes with your ratchet set, and we attached the conduit with hinges to the gas and the brake pedal. We have a piece of PVC pipe attached to the gear shifter, and we have a piece of rope that just pulls on the brake. And hopefully it works.
That's me before I started doing PT. Is it silly? Yeah. Is it a little crazy? Yeah. But think about it from the perspective of a religion, if you will, that has 2 tenets to it. If someone does something crazy, you get out of the way. Or 2, you try to help out. And recently, there's been quite a bit of stir in Silicon Valley with Project Maven as an example. And how do we fix this disconnect between these two areas? And I would argue that this is fundamentally not a technological problem or a policy problem. This is a human problem. I don't think it was intentional, but because of BRAC, Treasure Island, the Presidio, Alameda have all closed down. Your average Iraqi or Afghani, I would argue, might be more likely to have interacted with a person in uniform than your average Berkeley student. And especially in these days of a split country, we need to bridge this in order to be able to maintain our technological advantage. I was in a dinner with a bunch of executives and some high-ups in DoD, and they said, like, hey, screw Silicon Valley. Why do we really need Silicon Valley? And I was like, that's kind of like saying, well, I'm going to make a movie, but screw Hollywood. I'm just going to go to Oklahoma. You can't. We need to work on this from both sides. And we need to change the nature of the conversation. We need to change the context. And I want to talk about the state of nature for a moment. Fight or flight. It's everywhere you see. And when you have a fight or flight response, your body produces cortisol. It's a stress hormone. We're here in this room because our ancestors heard a loud noise in the middle of the night and they shot up in bed. And you see fight or flight nearly everywhere you look in nature. If they could, they would do this, right? Fight or flight. There's been 60 years of research on fight or flight. And these two researchers at UCLA explored all of the research, and they found that it was flawed because it was all based on one group of people. It was all based on men. And these two researchers, these two female researchers, realized that when they have a stressor, they sometimes tend and they sometimes befriend. And when you tend to befriend, your body produces oxytocin. There's a lot being written about oxytocin. A lot of it is not very accurate. What we do know about oxytocin is that it's a chemical that's released when a mother gives birth to her child. And when you look at your baby for the first time and you fall in love with him or her, that's oxytocin. Oxytocin makes you forget how horrible the experience was, and you're willing to do it again. How do we create levels of oxytocin? And how do we create these networks of inclusion? There's three questions that we need to ask ourselves. First is how do we change the context to empower the lower ranks? B, how do we expand the circle and become more inclusive? And C, how can we create belonging across the organization or across the country? And this brings us back to Berkeley. So I was an undergrad in Berkeley. I was a peace and conflict studies major, so a lot of my friends look like this. I have a riddle for you. How do you know if someone's vegan? They'll tell you, I'm vegan. So I just told you, get it? So I showed up, I was vegan. There was this animal rights group that was very angry and very negative and was going nowhere. And had about 8 members. I showed up to try to meet girls. It wasn't very effective. And realized that in order to actually be more effective, we needed to change the narrative. Rather than being exclusive and doing protests and all sorts of stuff, we need to be fun and entertaining. And our first campaign was, rather than thinking about vegans like this, let's think about them as fun. And we had something called McVegan. We had Veggie McVeggie. Gave out free veggie burgers. And McDonald's hears about this. This is 1995. And they sued us, I don't know why, for trademark infringement. And we said, no, McDonald's, like, we don't necessarily have anything against you. Why don't you just offer vegan options? So raise your hand if you've heard about veganism, at least heard about it. Most of you. I would argue the reason for that is because vegans started actually being fun and entertaining in the mainstream. And 24 years later, after our McVegan campaign, McDonald's announced their own McVegan burger. This is from Finland. They're about to introduce it in their headquarters in Chicago. How do we, in a way, McVeganize national security for areas like Silicon Valley? So a few years ago, I was in Baldwin, Kansas, running a program for the Army. This is downtown Baldwin. and this is where we're meeting. This is a hunting lodge, so I'm like, do you have any vegan options on this menu? And I'm sitting across from this guy who was an Apache pilot, and he's like talking to me about he likes to bow hunt because that's what he does. And he's like, you know, you Berkeley faculty aren't that bad. I was like, thank you, I guess. And I realized that if we put our politics aside for a moment, my Berkeley friends and you all actually have a lot more in common. Service, commitment to country. We might be coming to it from different perspectives, but our values are the same. And I had this crazy idea because I was starting to get exposed to you all. I was realizing this is a wonderful community. This is from a couple of months ago. I was like, you know, can we expose Berkeley to this? And vice versa. And I had this crazy idea, what if we bring actual people to talk? There's a class at Berkeley on war. It has about 400 people. They've never had anyone in uniform talk in the class on war. So we brought a couple of, when they were walking, this is the interesting story, when they were walking down the Berkeley campus, a couple people stopped them and they said, are you guys cops? No one, this is a good thing, no one spat in their face, no one protested, but I would argue that one of the biggest problems that DoD has is the fact that no one is protesting. Not that anyone should be treated with disrespect, but that the opposite of power isn't a protest, the opposite of power is indifference. I teach an undergrad class at Berkeley. I was talking about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. This kid raises up his hands and he's like, what war? I was like, wait a second, how many of you don't know that there's a war? About a third of the kids didn't know that there was a war going on. How do we fight this indifference? So in this class, afterwards, they talked to the students for about 50 minutes. And we had this idea, what if we create a partnership between Berkeley and the US military? And there's this program that was called the Broadening Program, and they would send 30 people for the summer. A couple of you all have been in this program. And they send people for 12 days. And it was a volunteer day, and I said, oh, why don't we volunteer at a Burning Man event? Bring the army to Burning Man, what can go wrong, right? And this is from the first year. There's all this art. And this guy right here on the right with the forklift is asking me, hey, who are all these wonderful people helping? And I'm like, US Army. He's like, huh. And we just changed the perception a little bit. It's these one-on-one type of conversations, the human connection. So the Berkeley City Council eventually hears about this. And in case this is a surprise, they tend to lean a little bit left. So they had a special meeting and about this. And they passed a unanimous resolution. And they actually declared June 4th, Bridging the Military-Civilian Divide Day. If the Berkeley City Council can reach out, what can we do in order to actually have better relations? Because unless we do this, I think this is a matter of national security. We have to change the context of the conversation. And it's illustrated by this cartoon. What would you all say about this fish here on the right? What are the attributes of it? Alone, what else? Strong, faster, better. You show this cartoon to kids in America, they'll tell you this fish is a leader. You show the exact same cartoon to kids in China, and they'll tell you that this fish is being pushed out. You can change the context simply by showing people a symbol of American items or of Chinese items, and they'll give you the different interpretation. Now I want to leave you with a couple of videos about changing the context of the conversation. This is from the Alps. People take a helicopter up, and then they ski down, but they're attached to a bunch of parachutes. This is what it looks like. Okay, how does it feel? Great, intense, what else? Scary? So I had this kind of weird week where I showed this in front of a bunch of people at Bragg, and they're like, yeah, sign me up, and my kids too. And then that same week I was at an insurance company, and they're like, the liability. Now we're going to look at the exact same video. This was the original video. And this new video is the exact same video, but just with a different soundtrack underneath. And see how it feels. Still the same content, but the context is a little bit different. And maybe you can see a little bit of the beauty in it, and the elegance, and the softness. And think about that in your leadership. It's not about changing the content. It's about changing the more human element of how we deliver the message by creating a sense of belonging. And if you can just do that, if you can bring Berkeley military together, think what we can do in the rest of our country. It's about these networks, and that together we can actually make a better world. So thank you.